So without further ado, we'll get started. Steve Collis is a professor of English at SFU and a local poet of international renown, and we're delighted to have him here. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Am. Thank you all for coming out. It's really wonderful. I was not sure what to expect, if there would be many people here at all, so thank you very much. I'll also acknowledge that we're on unceded Coast Salish territory. It's front and center all the time, doing anything outside of Vancouver and inside for that matter, but I always feel it when you're doing things outdoors and engaging with this territory in any kind of material or functional way. That's very apparent where we're standing. Can everyone hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Good. What I've got planned is I'll sort of a rambling introduction for a few minutes, a chunk of text I'll read while this video is playing behind me silently. Then I'm hoping we'll have some discussion. I actually had like a questionnaire that I did up. I wasn't sure if that's something that would be very useful to do, so I'm not sure we'll do that. I might distribute it, but I'm not sure that will be functional in this space and with this many people, so maybe we'll just have some discussion. And then in a final third, I'll come back and probably at this time anyhow, read one last short text at the end. Okay? So just the rambly introduction. This talk is basically about thinking about the idea of the future in the age of the Anthropocene, or at least in the age of climate change. Does anyone know that term, Anthropocene? It's becoming into common parlance, this idea that we're in an age now where human activity affects the entire planet geophysically and stratospherically, you could say. Therefore, we need a new term because we've completely altered the climate, at least in which, quote, human civilization evolved over the last 11,000 years, is quite possibly not the climate we're going to have anymore, or we don't have anymore. So rethinking that temporality, some of the funny things about the temporality is, by some people's drawing of the line, we've been in the Anthropocene for 200 years. You might as well start it at the start of Industrial Revolution and the explosion of fossil fuel usage. And that's probably just a convenient dating line, because it's hard to do this kind of thing. At what point, or is it when we cross 350 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere? Where is the line? But it has a weird temporality where maybe we've been in it for a while already, but also maybe we really won't see the effects in a really massive way for another 10 or 20 or however many years. So it's also gesturing ahead temporally at what's coming soon, as it were. So it's got that curious temporality. But clearly part of what we're told is coming is less, less of everything. And especially, a very fraught sense of future as any kind of potential space. So it causes me at least to rethink, to think about the future again anyhow. In thinking about the future, I found talking to other writers about it that they think it's a stupid thing to talk about. They can talk about anything. I like to talk about stupid things. But in part that's, I think, based on certain notions of utopian thought, certain notions of that it's hard not to veer into idealistic frames and ways of thinking about things. It's hard to avoid getting into a cheesy space marked hope. And that's some of the worry about the future. Also, that when we're thinking and busy talking about the future, we're ignoring the present, and things are happening in the present that we need to be on top of, as it were. But the way I'm approaching this idea of the future is by asking myself, how do we act now so that there is a future? How do we preserve a future that is being erased now in the present, actively, before it even arrives? So it's things that are happening at this moment that it will erase certain potentialities 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. We don't notice they're gone until we get there, but they're being taken off the table right now. So how do we respond to that situation? There's two ways that I'm responding, I guess. One is through literary texts, as well as I'm engaging with climate change and the climate justice movement. And the other way through grassroots organization, on the ground, direct action, sorts of things. But I find that significant. Not that I'm doing that, I just mean that those are significant areas to approach this issue from, because I think approaching it purely at an intellectual level is not getting us anywhere, i.e. it's not sinking in. So we can talk climate science, gesture at my science friend in the audience, till we're blue in the face, but for a lot of people it's not sinking in yet, they're not getting it. We can talk political economy and all sorts of sociological disciplines, but again, it doesn't seem to be sinking in. So for me, my response is to go to where my limited skill set is anyhow, into my body in some way and respond at the level of the heart, at the level of having a body to put in space. So I've come direct from the forest. I'm burning up today covered in mud and having a day of being sweaty and getting rain on. As there's a group of us, a pretty large, diverse group of people here in Vancouver who are holding a 24-hour encampment in the forest on the side of the Burning Mountain on top of where Kinder Morgan, the oil company, it's not playing yet, that's good, no, not yet, are trying to drill a borehole to do testing for their pipeline they want to build, which they now would prefer to bore sideways through Burning Mountain to get from the tank farm on one side of the mountain to the facility at Westridge on the other side of the mountain where they load it onto tankers. So we're sitting on top of it right now where they want to work and trying not to move, and hopefully they won't be able to move us. Let's see what happens. So I find that really important, that idea of bodies in space and that kind of direct participation that way. And the kind of sideways, slantways talking and thinking that you do through literary texts. Now, in part, what I want to get around to with those ideas is that maybe we need to do this with climate change because of the kind of information climate change is presenting us. There's a late 19th, early 20th century logician, Charles Sanders Peirce, who described three different primary forms of communication, of exchange of information and representation, ultimately, he says, that animals use. And actually, the first two kinds, all animals, us and all the other animals use. Maybe the third kind, only human beings use. And these three are what he calls iconic communication, indexical communication, and symbolic communication. Indexical is when something directly physically represents what it is in some way. I think the easiest example is to look at, in the animal kingdom, as people used to say, species that are clearly marked by gender because they're totally different colors, sizes, shapes. And that's a kind of iconic communication. That being is communicating, I'm of this gender, for when it meets another being of its same species. Indexical information is a little more complicated because it's about an interpretation of a particular piece of information. So a tree falls in the forest, an animal hears that tree, and the animal interprets that in some way. Does the animal say, that was a loud noise and I'm getting the hell out of here, because maybe that's a predator? Or does an animal hear that loud noise and look up and go, ooh, supper may be over there, and start heading in that direction? But through some sort of experiential process, the animal has heard that sound before and interprets it as representative of something, either danger or dinner or potential mate or whatever it might be that it's interpreting that. So indexical is a kind of pointing information. And then symbolic is language, ultimately, is the key example, anyhow, of symbolic communication. The relationship between the sign and the signified. So T-R-E-E, tree in English, has no real connection to an actual physical tree out in the world. It only connects to that via an entire system of language that enables that communication to mean anything. What I'm trying to work my way along, circle around to, is the idea that maybe climate change isn't a symbolic piece of information, but it's actually indexical. It's a very, very large tree falling over in the forest. And our attempts to respond to it at a symbolic level, to articulate the scientific meaning of this point, what's being pointed at, of the pointing gesture, or the philosophical meaning, or the sociological meaning of this thing, I think we do need that, but it's not ultimately grappling with what the piece of information is, because it's talking a different level of communication, different kind of communication. Because what we're hearing is a really loud crash. And the reaction should be probably very physical. Duck and cover, run and hide, marshal up and do something about the invader that's crashing through the forest right now. All right. Sure. So I'm going to read this text. Well, I found two great books at the Paper Hound right before I came over here. One is a novel called Super Still from 1970, about an oil tinker spill in Puget Sound. Dun, dun, dun. And it's funny, it seems like all these, I mean, it begins in Prince William Sound, Alaska, which is of course where the Exxon Valdez, 17 years after this novel, would hit a rock, or 15 years, 17 years. And Pipeline, very celebratory 1974. This is what's making Canada a great nation, because we've managed to build a pipeline, oddly enough, across the what does it say here? What's the Ontario geological formation, the Canadian Shield, right? And so that's a massive barrier to putting a pipeline. It's not a mountain, buddy, but anyway. I understand that part. Interesting. Okay. So this text exists somewhere between an essay and a poem, and it sort of leans toward quotation and a more discursive engagement, sometimes, although always very briefly and fragmentarily, sometimes leans more in the direction of a poem. And I kind of want it to be very loose like this, and it's filled with loose ends and misconnections that are just left for people to think about or do something with, perhaps. I should also say this is a compressed, shorter, and edited version for what was provided ahead of time online, so it's a little bit different than that, a little bit shorter. Yeah, I don't think I need to say anything else about it. I'm just going to let this play in the background. I want to do something with this eventually, but this is available on YouTube. It's split into 9 parts. It's a 1953 documentary about the building of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which is the pipeline that comes here into Burnaby, the Kinder Morgan are now trying to replace by digging a new pipeline. Oiled across the Rockies. What you're missing is the great kind of goofy 1950s documentary voice that's in the background of this thing. Get my goofy voice instead. All right. So there's a number of documents I'm working with here. One of them is, one of the documents I work with are there are documents created that are available online by Shell Oil Company, and there are scenario plans. About every 5 years, Shell Oil puts out scenarios for the future in which Shell will find wonderful ways to keep making lots of money. All right. So scenarios for poems I will not have written. Begins with a large quotation. Quote, "Forest perambulations existed since at least the time of Magna Carta. They were ceremonial walks about a territory for asserting and recording its boundaries, that is, beating the bounds. A perambulation was a kind of peripatetic map, or walkabout, in which briar-scratched skin, stubbed toes, aching legs aided the memory. The perambulation of the New Forest, authorized by Charles II in 1671, resulted in a Latin document that, translated, comprises a single sentence over 6 pages long of approximately 1,980 words. Many hundreds of prepositional phrases, the grammatical unit most having to do with position and direction, to, from, by, beyond, across, in, and human and natural landmarks, ditch, post, hedge, vale, pond, gate, rover, oak, beach, grave, croft, marsh, lane, road, ford, with current name, alias, former names, thus making the text layered with semantic history and compact with minute orientation." That's from Peter Leinebaugh's book, The Magna Carta Manifesto. Let's do this. Park on Ridgeview, or walk up to Ridgeview having stepped off the 135 bus at Hastings and Duthie and enter Burnaby Mountain Park via Ridgeview Trail. Straight, wide, and clear, then left onto Gnome's Home Trail. smaller, winding, passing between cut ends of logs, having fallen long ago, trail veering towards the inlet, light coming down or across through broadleaf maple and alder leaves, turning fall yellows and browning towards the earth, where roots become obstacles, then near cedar, with roots stepping up above the ground, add a non-indigenous holly, turn right uphill and follow new, even narrower path, ferns and salmonberry and salal close about, finches startle and chirp, maybe a deer. We've also seen 2 bears, heard coyotes, and the deep, distant, hollow sound you can't write. A raven makes. Then you see the trail on the right, middle of thin, unknown, deciduous trees, makeshift branch barricades, maybe a tent, maybe a hammock. We can't tell. Just ahead of you, the clearing Kinder Morgan made for geotechnical survey work or boreholes for pipeline construction. 13 trees cut, the moss rigged, the fern studded maples old about us. Here we keep watch. Here we have occupied what they would mine. Here a banner, no pipelines on stolen native land. That clear enough for you. You can see it from the air, maybe the future too. I should have had a drink before making raven noises. I had thought you could perambulate the bounds of certain mine sites, proposed mine sites, Catface Mountain, Ajax, Testan Binney, also known as Fish Lake, reclaiming them as commons. Make a poem from this. A piercing light radiates from regret. The concept before the process is the process, or so we are told. Bertinsky's photographs of oil spills that are dark tears in iris-textured water, mines that are deep terraced boreholes into the earth like descending rings of ochre infernos, aestheticized into new opacity on gallery walls and between hard covers to sit atop coffee tables. Take, for example, Taseko Mines Limited, TKO, on the Toronto Stock Exchange, which is great. Which has for decades been attempting to develop a mine at Fish Lake in what is called Central British Columbia, sacred to the Chilcotin people, whose traditional lands it is. Can you claim as common what Indigenous land defenders have claimed as home? Can you claim it as art? I walk off the end of a phrase into the space companies have marked portfolio. It seems in my memory to have been a frequent occurrence that they tested air raid sirens in my hometown in the 1970s. That long, low but piercing, eerie wail, slow and rising, not at all raven-like. From, I thought or have imagined, the hilltop near where I lived amongst Gary Oaks. So people could practice and be aware, duck and cover if the bomb. So people would be vigilant if, because Victoria was a port and one of only 2 Canadian naval bases, with a large dry dock, and so likely on a target list for Soviet ICBMs, or so people said, ducking cover. So sometimes I would think long and hard about that if, about that flash and mushroom cloud and devastation, and about Dr. Strangelove and the song We'll Meet Again, and something called Nuclear Winter, which would follow maybe for centuries. And now how nuclear winter rhymes so closely with global warming as bad weather we make, erasing futures, fatal in our flaws. Because both are atmospheric devastations we might not survive, but certainly would have caused. Because we are doomsday species device. Though I hear no weekly sirens being tested today. What sort of space is the future? And how might we beat its bounds, claiming it as common, as something we all equally must have, need to have access to? Scenario. A single company proposes mines in both remote BC and Latin American locations, displacing the indigenous. These mines may or may not be built in some future we haven't destroyed yet, although maybe we have, sometimes it seems so already. And while it would not be easy to go there to see what could be lost, I like the idea of the existence of those removes without my having to visit them, plunk in a mental space which is also a real space I cannot verify or occupy. I note that this company, seemingly abstract and digital, a remote application of capital, has its head offices in my hometown, which is locatable as an address, if also difficult to visit. Security surveillance state. Scenario. A company pipes diluted bitumen from the Alberta tar sands through 1,150 kilometers of pipeline. This bitumen is hot and pressurized and corrosive, and when it spills, which it does, Kalamazoo, it sinks to the bottom of bodies of water, releasing clouds of toxic gas. This pipeline, running through my hometown to the harbor where the oil was loaded onto supertankers, was built in 1953, a period documentary film. And here, Oil Across the Rockies details its construction. It now snakes around the perimeter of the university, built in 1965, where I, born in 1965, work. I cross the buried line every day in a vehicle powered by fossil fuel. You can walk along its well-marked route, yellow warning signs, call before you dig. But you can't walk around it per se. It's a line, and it cuts across or through you. Locked-in climate change is in part based on the fact that there is enough carbon still in the ground, and yet identified, calculated, speculated upon, given value form, sold and invested before it is even removed, to fry us all well and truly. That is, its mining is financially locked in, an asset, already part of the bottom line, enough to push us past CO2 limits scientists have identified as limits to a livable planet. In this scenario, the future is being enclosed, monetized, bought and sold, and already burnt. Mutually assured economic destruction. But in what way was mutually assured destruction ever mutual? I can hear the sirens of childhood still sounding. We are now already the future the past dreamt of, or are we? Are we the ones we've been waiting for? Once we were just a hypothesis of what may come to be. How now that we are here do we negate futures we don't want to unfold, futures already being constructed all around us by doomsday market forces, and so open the future to other scenarios? Shell Oil has been using scenario planning to explore the future since the early 1970s. Shell's futurists developed these what-if scenarios of plausible futures, they say, in order to make their business plans ideologically palatable. These plans have increasingly come to accept climate change as a plausible future factor. In fact, Shell is one of the few major oil companies that even is willing to talk about climate change. Apparently, a future without oil, a future without Shell, is not plausible. Futurists are investors too. Time is money. A thick coat of choice applied, of chance applied. What if the future was not driven by the market is not a scenario that can be considered. There are only two scenarios when it comes down to it. The final solutions of Shell's shell game, scramble and blueprint, they're called. They basically map conceptually as suicidal free-for-all fight for the remaining planetary resources, that's scramble, or planned and careful diversification of fossil fuel production, which nevertheless proceeds apace as a response to civil society pressure to curb carbon emissions. We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way. The choice is yours. There's no choice at all. I've long been fascinated by Stanley Kubrick's 1964 film, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Texan Slim Pickens, rodeo riding an atomic bomb down over a Soviet base. The idea of the doomsday machine. Something once triggered, we cannot turn off no matter how brainless we set our destructions in motion. All is lost until we meet again. Then all of us singing and dancing our own graves, and those of other species less invested in mutual destruction. Originally, the film was supposed to end with a pie fight in the US war room. That would have been good. Near the end of the film, the barely reformed Nazi Dr. Strangelove played brilliantly by Peter Sellers, proposes a scenario in which a select and eugenically chosen few humans are preserved in deep mine shafts until the nuclear winter is over in about 100 years, give or take, and the Earth can be repopulated. Just in case the Soviets have the same idea and sneak a bomb into their mine shaft, General Turgidson, played by George C. Scott, recommends the remnants of the American portion of the human race, the most powerful men and the most stimulating women, take a bomb or two beneath ground with them to avoid a potential future mine shaft gap. Strange love. We have wedged ourselves under the cloud of one doom or another, half-life of manufactured weather, manufactured consent, to work our way back to present gross national product, half-life breeding prodigiously beneath the ground, a spirit of bold curiosity for adventure ahead, cobalt, thorium, G, a sacrifice required for the future, strange love and half-life, and after the winter, who will rule? We cannot only ever be free and only one species alone, no? Same rule, same consequence. After the climate, there is no spring and no summer. Animals bred and slaughtered? No rule or scenario, no, in a whole mine, old mine bombs, carbon, nuclear, climate, winter change. Breeding even more prodigiously than us, who mutually assured if the future is no scenario, no, not slaughtered, no home. In carbon capture, an unproven process Shell relies upon to make its future scenarios plausible, waste carbon from the extraction and burning of fossil fuels is somehow stored underground. Say in old mine shafts, they're proposing. In case of nuclear war and its attendant nuclear winter, we carbon-based beings store our ruler elite selves underground. Either way, we are all apparently in the business of waste management. Scenario. Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain Pipeline, having been twinned, is now carrying almost 900,000 barrels of oil per day as it sneaks through suburban Vancouver, filling 35 supertankers each month in the harbor of, quote, the greenest city in the world, end quote. There was a line rupture near the Pitt River Bridge, spilling massively into the Fraser River just east of the city. Oil quickly coats the surface and shores of the river throughout its delta, winding through farms and the city. Correction. Diluted bitumen, upon coming into contact with air and water, separates into the rapidly evaporating toxins of its condensate and the heavier bitumen, which sinks in water, unrecoverable, killing the very base of the food chain. In this scenario, quote, oil that reaches the mouth of the river is discharged into the Strait of Georgia, comment, Salish Sea, with considerable momentum. It is likely that this oil will affect shorelines on the opposite side of the strait, 20 kilometers away, Kinder Morgan blithely projects. So I'm summarizing their own scenario from their NED proposal. Response, quote, pipeline spills can have both positive and negative effects on local and regional economies, both in the short and long term. Spill response and cleanup creates business and employment opportunities for affected communities, regions, and cleanup service providers, end quote. Kinder Morgan National Energy Board application. Strange love. Question. A device which will destroy all human and animal life on Earth is? Answer. Civilization? Question. Has reason any hope of stopping madness? Answer. You're going to have to answer the Coca-Cola Company. End quote. Question. Have we made weapons that outstrip our ability to control them? Answer. The internal combustion engine. Question. Tragic but distinguishable post-war states. Answer. Instrumental rationality, as when culture and barbarism merge into value form. Question. Will survivors envy the dead? Answer. Each species marks a silence as a mineshaft abandons the temporal. Question: who is trying to deprive you of your precious fluids? Answer: each oil company, its own planned economy, its own internal exhaustion engine. Commons appear as clusters, shaped spaces, surrounds. Borders matter and are mutual. On maps of mines and proposed mine sites, you can imagine walking around the colored blobs, the areas encircled by dashed perimeters, shaded zones, reclaiming space. These borders bind and exclude. But you cannot walk around a line. You can walk along it or across it. It commands you to follow or disobey. Everything today seems struck to transect, connect, cut through. The striation of the smooth. Indigenous territories are globular, elastic, flexible tracts of terrain in traditional use, relational space mapped by bodies and movement, ecologies that include human metabolism. Pipelines, crossed out, cut through them, or mines, crossed out, are gouged out of them. We resource, we prospect, we calamitous wrecks. We tracking and tracing of lines to connect all in commodious follies flow. Cartographic features too, colored blobs, dotted lines which encircle. Cities have limits they try to exceed. Reservations have often have straight line borders, colonial cubism cut on rolling earth over which the shapes of cities often spread. When an oil company forces access to an urban park, the colonial machine doubles down, cutting simultaneously into settler senses of the public and indigenous territory and title at once. All that lives has only ever been a resource to those who profit from the exploitation of life, whether they send conquistadors or oil prospectors. The cut made into a park, cut down through territory, finally meets bone at the future, already scored by our mining into time. But what about walking around the future, or crossing its inevitable yet malleable path? I orient in that direction, walk towards it as a responsibility, not a right to the future, but a responsibility towards the future. That there be an earth to walk upon, that unborn we are not cancelled in advance, no refunds. Take direction from new definition of Aboriginal title, Chilcotin Supreme Court decision, quote, "It is collective title held not only for the present generation, but for all succeeding generations. It cannot be encumbered in ways that would prevent future generations of the group from using and enjoying it. Nor can the land be developed or misused in a way that would substantially deprive future generations of the benefit of the land," unquote. In this scenario, whatever you want, living beings, where did all this fresh water come from? Abrupt abutments of apple to tree, berry to bush. These honeybees are everywhere. Where'd all the exploitation go? Geez. Wondering what macro thinks each micro abutting micro. 2050 is some shit, huh? I like it when the tide washes up these shells on clean pea gravel shore. Sans plastic, sans cesium. Everything's eating everything still, but just enough to continue. Clean shore where life veritably sparkles abundance. Wasn't a dream. These shells once homes and homes again humming. Like a hermit crab or whatever might move in, clean dig, swept, shore clean, swept. In this scenario, not a scenario, we have fresh, clean digs and move in, loving. Listening to the sea inside and out, listening to wind and water, listening, we company, we healthcare, we free room. Sometimes it gets even darker. Scenario: extreme weather caused by anthropogenic climate change, drought and or water polluted by fracking and or oil spills rising, food prices escalating, employment or causal casual, temporary employment, extreme personal debt, and rampant home foreclosures, escalating and aggressively visible economic inequality, all leading to a general situation of unrest and a nothing more to lose attitude amongst the ever-burgeoning underclass, manifesting as regular street demonstrations, occupations, riots, and looting on a scale rarely seen in North America. Preparation. Effective militarization and expansion of law enforcement, privatization and expansion of for-profit prison system despite generally declining crime rates, legislative changes that largely criminalize dissent, including the wearing of masks, the photographing and filming of law enforcement personnel, the classification of most public gatherings as unlawful, and the categorization of certain speech acts as terrorism. An expansive and even pervasive web of online and urban spatial surveillance to both dissuade and or track, capture troublemakers. And sometimes it gets lighter. On Burnaby Mountain, caretakers inhabit forest watching for sudden pipeline, sudden stabs at profit made from poisoning earth. Watch for Kinder Morgan, their trucks and low-flying drones. We rotate, spell off, turn, and take turns standing in damp under tree drip watching bears come and watch, deer come, coyote, the raven's deep, unmistakable call, which is a withering warning to billion-dollar oil companies. In alder, in maple, fern, salal, and salmonberry, near train and bird song and plain sound, on mountain, on watch. Among stumps, red round, startling flocks bespeaking a theory of swarm, plane drone, train echo, mountain, on watch. Beside dead cut boughs, their drying leaf curl by fallen trunks and bare presence on unceded territory, occupied, on watch. Over the inlet downslope attached to social media, over proposed pipeline route, under Capitol, on mountain, on watch. I think that's the end of that document, so let's pause and talk. That was a fast pause. So maybe I'll send this questionnaire document around that you can maybe like take it away with you and think about it and get back to me. I'd like to hear your responses to that. But just as a general, can we just open up the general comments or questions at this point, and then we'll see if we want to look at that at all.
There's a manifesto in here.
Oh, I want the manifesto back. That might come in handy. I was looking for that. I don't see it, so I just handed them out. What's there? Other comments, or should I read one more little thing? And then where are we at time-wise? So
We have a question back here?
yeah, great.
Hello. So, if I'm not mistaken, from what I remember from the summary of what this lecture is about, it's about like how about these like narratives or like discourse that of interested business corporations to kind of like make their ideas more popular and more accepted to the majority population, and how through language can that be countered. So it just because I probably didn't get this from your lecture, so just kind of like maybe if it's possible for you in a somewhat summarized form how that thing can be achieved.
Oh, how can it be achieved?
Oh, and just another thing was also for adding this one. Like I didn't hear much of the three philosophical categories of like symbolic.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at a couple problems or a couple of different ways you can look at this one problem. Let's put it that way. I'm looking at our struggle to see the future as something that we have an immediate relationship to, and that we would need to act in order to do things about the future because of that level of abstraction. But then on the other side of that, corporations have no problem at all interacting with the future as a very material, ready thing that they deal with. So, tracking, for instance, the idea of blockchain climate change and the fact that they've literally monetized it. When scientists go in and say there are 200 billion, whatever it is, gallons, liters, whatever, of oil here, that's actually trading pretty quick. long before it's ever out of the ground. That's being traded on the market, which is just, it's bizarre, but that's what they mean by locked-in climate change, is that, in part, that's what they mean, is that you've literally spent the money. You've got to get it out. It's in the market already. It's part of the value of the company that's got the claim. And that company's stocks are being traded. And they're in part being traded on the basis of the oil reserves they're claiming. Therefore, for the company to consider, so it's like the idea of a bubble in a way, right? There's the bubble is the untapped oil that they're claiming and speculating on. Now, what happens if the oil doesn't come out of the ground? What happens to the company? What happens to the stocks? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So companies are constantly very materially engaged with the future. That it's absolutely something you can buy, sell, and then if you follow logic through, if the market functions the way it, quote, supposed to function, that means that stuff's got to come out of the ground. So they've already spent the future of actually mining it. So that fascinates me. And it fascinates me when you get these companies that will produce these scenarios, saying, well, this is how it will work. This is how we're gonna be a viable company. So you're right. It just becomes a language when you're posing a question. It's in part ideological. It's in part the company trying to the way it presents itself to the world. That's what Shell is doing with the scenario planning, is to say, look how forward-looking we are. Ultimately, look how avant-garde we are. We're not like the other companies. We're actually putting some documents online and trying to have a public debate around how should we react as an oil company to climate change. No, it's totally artificial, because they're simply going to be, what they're saying is they're still going to be an incredibly profitable company whose stocks you should be buying as fast as you can. But they're going to do it in one of two ways. Anyhow, once we look at that picture of that materialization of the future, how can we take that back? How can we materialize the future differently? The language I'm drawn to is the language around the comments. The idea that there are shared resources isn't even the right word. I would prefer the word responsibilities ultimately, but I'll use the word resources for now. There are shared resources upon which life depends. And the thing that capitalism does to the future cancels the thing that we need, which is a resource we can depend upon. Because it uses it, destroys it, makes it unusable again. I don't have an answer, right? I'm just wanting to probe around the outside of that question and try and figure out ways, think toward ways we can rethink the future as a commons, and then ultimately protect it as such. Andrea?
I'm interested in, especially in light of the stuff you just said, the language you're relying on in the questionnaire, which is very personalized. It's the second person, personal. What is your greatest fear?
Yeah.
What would you be relieved to see happen or not happen? And so I'm just wondering what your strategy behind that is. If the idea is to arrive at a kind of fear or relief that is held in common or arrived at in common, right? I'm interested in your approach.
Yeah. Do you mean that the questionnaire is personalized, so like it becomes your personal responses?
Yeah.
Because I only envision something will be then shared, and then
Well,
if we did like a workshop, right?
Yeah.
We could collate our responses and try and create a communal picture of what we might all agree on.
Yeah.
That we would like.
The hypothesis, is there one that we would probably come up with a lot of the same responses? Or?
Well, that's what I'm hoping.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That there would be a way of pooling together those kinds of responses and finding a quote common ground. But the other thing I'm doing there is it's almost impossible not to pose the question in a corny way or a way that comes across as corny. How do you talk about those kind of things? Although I think we need to have those kind of conversations. So in part, there's an attempt to offer a slightly quirky or silly way of looking at it.
It doesn't seem corny to me. It's just,
It does to me. A little bit. Because again, I think that in that kind of thing, you're skating me close to that whole discourse around hope, which really is a watery, slippery thing that is hard to separate from its abuses, whether via Hallmark cards or politicians or whatever. And I'm less interested in the future in terms of hope or hopefulness. But I'm actually interested in real practical and material senses.
I have a question, I guess, about planning, which is kind of coming up,
Yeah,
and like this question of scale.
yeah.
Because in the reading, there's a way that at times you tend to equate human civilization and culture with like barbarism and destruction. So, you know, it's kind of like this anarcho-primitivist kind of sentiment that I have a lot of sympathy with, right, given the consequences of the Enlightenment project or whatever. But I also wonder about that kind of position's aversion to like the world-building dimension of utopian thinking, right? There seems to be like a tension between characterizing world-building ideology as necessarily barbaric, right, or something. And so I wonder if you agree with this idea, and if so, if you could maybe speak to it a bit. If like using the indexical as a way to think, drafting blueprints that are not the ones that are offered to us by Shell, is a way to avoid like the pitfalls of Enlightenment rationalism, which is so invested in the symbolic.
I want to say yes.
Right. I mean, I suspect that you think that. I suspect that you think that the indexical is an alternative. It allows us to do world-building work without investing so much in what we might see as the dangers of, like, symbolic thinking.
You're giving me too much credit.
Okay.
No, I haven't thought about the indexical in those terms. I haven't linked it to the question of planning actually at all. So
Okay.
I'm happy that's there, and as you bring it up, I think that is a really good idea. I want to think about that. But that's not necessarily what I was trying to convey.
Okay.
That was not authorial intent. But I think that's really kind of fascinating, actually. No, as far as the planning question, I totally do agree. I think we do need to do that, and we do need to be utopian and allow these kind of postulates of other ways of relating, other ways of building community, other ways of thinking about what social reproduction is, what the stakes are, and what it should be achieving. I totally think we need that kind of thinking. So I'm not trying to hold up a kind of an anarcho-primitivist kind of thing here, where if we just go into the woods and stay there,
Where you've been all day,
it
right?
should be well.
Yeah.
I don't know that it will.
Well, I guess part of the reason I ask is that there's a tendency in some approaches to some of these really global level problems like economic and ecological disaster to reinvest in the Enlightenment project and just turn to new rationalism with like accelerationist discourse and all this stuff that I find really suspicious and like kind of worrying. But so I wondered if maybe there's like an alternative in what you're doing at the moment. But
This other document that I could read in a few minutes is exactly in that direction.
Cool.
And I thought of reading it tonight too, because I thought to the negation of that first document, this is the positive maybe. But hold on for that a second, I think. George, were you adding a comment on there? Because Natalie, I think, had a question too.
It sort of follows on from that, but not exactly. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the idea of the indexical,
Yeah.
but it seems as a gesture that, like irony, it assumes a lot about common understanding. So if you point to something, you are pointing in a way that sort of looks at someone else and says, you know why I'm pointing at this, right? Which has to do with irony as well. I thought maybe that had to do with the reason you'd gone back to irony in this. But there's also like a danger there, right? You point at it and people get the wrong idea, or people don't understand why you're pointing.
Sure. Yeah. I think there's a lot to tool around with in that idea. And yet again, I'm starting from this simple point of maybe this sheds some light on why something like this big abstract climate change thing is difficult for us to process cognitively in the way human beings have become so accustomed to processing, in complicated discursive ways, because it's not of that nature at all. It's purely indexical. It's a big loud noise that just happened, and we need to figure out, if to follow that hypothetical situation, that illustration along. I think ultimately we'd have to hear the noise quite a few times and develop a strategy like any other animal would of what do you do when you hear that noise. And I think that's where we need to start figuring out how to react to that big loud crashing sound. Which might be running and hiding in the woods, but I think it also might be running actually toward the disaster and helping people that are being hurt by the disaster, which is what we see at a very material, real level when a climate-related weather event happens on a massive scale. That on the ground, anyhow, if you ignore governments, on the ground, what do people do when your neighbor's house falls over or whatever, is you run to your neighbor's house. And you start pulling it apart and finding it. And then you organize and figure out where water is, and you pass the water along the line, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that seems to be, Rebecca Solomon has a book about this, doesn't she? That seems to be what we keep doing in situations of large-scale disaster, is they're very indexical, clearly. They go with lots of crashing and noise, and we run into the space of the crash and try and help. That's encouraging. And that's maybe an appropriate kind of a reaction to this indexical piece of information, climate change, is we should be rushing into the locations where we heard the crash and figure out what we need to do there. Natalie.
I think the place.
The moment passed.
I think the place of my question is passed.
Sorry.
No.
Yeah.
If nonviolent civil disobedience fails in dealing with the situations like these, is there any place for violent disobedience?
Yeah, I don't discount violence as a situation that we may get ourselves into. And by we, I mean people living on this planet in the number of years coming up. I try to organize with people on that basis of nonviolence, but I also know that there are assholes that if they don't stop doing what they're doing, there may be situations in which violence happens. I guess I would describe it that way. Violence happens. I'm not actively planning that violence, but I can see situations arising in which cornered animals react. Right? That's what we do.
I guess I will throw it. I'm just wondering. I'm wondering about the split, maybe that is made generally. I think it's outside of this talk as well, between fear and hope. And I guess I was thinking that we maybe don't, or this was my hypothesis. So maybe we don't need to identify our fears because we have plenty of them. But in order to move beyond the symbolic, it requires a confidence in resistance. So I guess I just wonder about starting with identifying our greatest fears for the future versus starting at a point that pushes us beyond that immediately. Because my hypothesis is the reason why irony and the symbolic are still attractive is because we are motivated by fear. And that's the dominant affect in neoliberalism.
It's the condition that's created.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You may be absolutely right there. That's really interesting. So it's really, I'm trying to think back to what you said was what you would posit in place of that fear would be a confidence in organizing. Is that what you said?
Yeah. So it's like hope is like maybe 100 steps ahead. Like the utopian is 100 steps ahead. Yeah. But maybe a closer step is a confidence in organizing and working collectively. That doesn't even, it's not even like taking a stab at hope or utopia.
Mm-hmm. That's really good. I mean, I would totally agree, I think. I'm posing that question the way it's posed there, in part simply to get that thinking going on. Okay, so what am I imagining is coming down the road that I want to be able to picture it, and then, so gesture at it, but also conceptually take it and go, okay, not that. Let's get rid of that thing. Okay, what's the next thing? Okay, let's get rid of that thing. That's the reason we're starting that way. But I think you're right that there's a real problem with fear. And the reality is, and the other things I've tried to talk about tonight is I absolutely feel that confidence in organizing and collective action, and feel it sort of functioning every day. as many people, I know many people in this room do, and different things they're doing. So I would totally agree with you. Maybe that's not right to begin there. Good point.
I
need
didn't
editors.
mean it to be a
I
point,
need
but
editors.
it's a hypothesis.
No, I
just
think it's really
wondering.
important. I think it's really important. The other thing a friend of mine said about this same kind of this topic, I guess, in a way, and he's a filmmaker, and he's working on a film right now on this grief counselor from Ontario called Stephen Jenkinson, something like that. Anyhow, he hates the idea of hope, for instance. He thinks it's the worst thing to ever go anywhere near. And he says, for one thing, it kills grief. And we absolutely need grief as a process in our lives. And human beings always have grieved, and it's been an important part of our cultural development and cultural expression. And if we don't, and grief is very different, again, as an affect, to line up with things like fear and hope. There's all sorts of interesting things you could say about grief that are very different than other things, and maybe actually, I don't know what word I want, not better, that's not the right word, but whatever, you know, they may not create the same roadblocks that some of those other affects can do. So I'm thinking through that idea too still, and I'm trying to figure out how I feel about it.
Well, grief is good because it contains within it both of the dialectical movements, both directions at once, rather than risking getting like all caught up in one direction versus the other.
Yeah.
I mean, in grief work, you're both mourning and moving ahead.
Exactly. And that's what I'm trying to grapple here. That's
almost
exactly right.
kind of scary to
Yeah.
back and forth.
Yeah, for sure. So he literally says we need to be able to grieve about climate change too. That's part of our response. It shouldn't just be fear or hope, but that we actually need to grieve about what's going on. You know, the fact that there's 50% less life on planet Earth now than there was 40 years ago. It's a pretty shocking fact that we've now come up with since 1970. The other thing I'm thinking about in light of this idea of the Anthropocene, which, again, I think there's problems with the word, and in fact this piece that I'm going to read is a little bit about the problem with the word, which is that it still puts too much focus on the anthros, on this species that caused the problem. And then we like Sean suggested, you get stuck in this kind of enlightenment. Oh well, we'll figure out another tool that'll fix the fuck up we made. Don't worry, we'll figure it out. We're the big daddies in charge. And of course, Anthropocene as a term for a picture of totalization of human impact on the planet, ignores where the real drivers are. So some people say, oh, it's actually we should say the capitalist, which is a really ugly and awkward word. So I don't think that word quite works. But I don't think we found the right word, because I think neither Anthropocene or capitalist are ideal. And maybe we don't need something more complicated than capital. Maybe we do. I don't know. But that's clearly what's going on. It's what has altered this planet geophysically to the extent that it is. That the ocean currents may change, or the climate's changing, that the Arctic is thawing, the poles are disappearing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all capitalism. I.e. that none of that would happen without a system that premised upon unlimited economic growth. None of that would happen. Okay.
Do you want the video on?
No, I don't. Oh, sure, why not? Let's have visuals. They don't have any relation to each other, but sometimes it's a good thing. And actually, they probably do. So this is just briefly part of a short thing called a manifesto of the biotariot. And I'm thinking about this invented term. If we once thought of the struggle we were involved in as involving the proletariat and class struggle at that level, we're needing to scale it up maybe to an even broader category, which is life itself. To go along with this idea of the Anthropocene and the capitalist scene, this totalization of exploitation. Maybe we need an even wider category to think through. And if we think through that category, maybe we can get around some of the pitfalls of the Anthros and the Enlightenment. 1. When we compare humans to animals in terms of mistreatment, they were treated like animals, like here in the media, in Gaza, or Syria, or the Sudan, or we mean no disrespect to animals. We mean only that animals, including human beings, are often mistreated exploited, and accorded no dignity. These processes are increasingly systematized and totalized across the biological spectrum. 2. First, a provisional definition, the biotariot, that portion of existence that is enclosed as a resource, human or otherwise, by and for those who direct and benefit from the accumulation of wealth. So, laboring human beings generally, most animals and plants, forest, wetland, and grassland ecosystems, water, land itself, as it provisions and enables biological life broadly, minerals that lie beneath the surface of the land, common wastes and sinks too, into which the waste products of resource extraction and the production and use are spilled, primarily the atmosphere and the oceans, primarily in the form of carbon and petroleum products. It's that large, the enclosed and exploited life of this planet. 3. Is it possible to politicize life as such? To even conceptually imagine its class composition? To read it cross-biotically as social? I believe that current world conditions push us in this direction, make this an unavoidable move, if the Anthropocene, a term that possibly obfuscates as much as it clarifies, is coterminous with the scientific foundation of life as a general category, Lamarck, 1801, introducing the idea of biology as a unified science of all cellular life, as well as with the historical development of capitalism, then the biotariot comes into being as a response to the fluorescence of the Anthropocene, as a reminder of its biopolitical foundations, very broadly speaking. Once we can perceive the total impact of capitalism on life itself, just then does it become necessary to develop a new political consciousness and new revolutionary subjectivity on the basis of life as such. 4. This is the reason to propose a biotariot, the enclosure and exploitation of life in all its manifold aspects, from boreal forests to sea turtles, to Bangladeshi garment workers, to the homeless of the world's major cities, to sex workers, to precariously employed adjunct professors, to coral reefs and honeybees, and so on and so forth, has reached a stage in which we, all of life, are in the same desperate and drunken boat, constrained by a system of total and planetary accumulation that even the term capitalism, perhaps, cannot adequately capture anymore. In what sense is this economics? This means of the production of financial inequality that systematically impacts and imperils life itself. 5. Enclosure, Peter Leinebaugh notes, a quote at the beginning of the other piece, Peter Leinebaugh notes, involves at once the taking of land and the taking of bodies. Leinebaugh is noting the historical convergence of the enclosure of common lands and the body snatchers who stole and murdered commoners and other poor people to provide cadavers for the burgeoning medical schools of early 19th century England. There's quite a trade in this. But we can extend this analysis to the taking of land from indigenous people under colonialism and the extension of colonialism into the current era of extreme resource extraction and the taking of bodies evident in both the residential school system and the vast numbers of murdered and missing indigenous women in Canada. Going even further, the taking of land becomes almost total under current conditions, where the entire surface of the earth and its atmosphere too functions either as productive resource or sink for waste products, including carbon emissions. And the taking of bodies includes the capture of nearly all animals in factory farms, zoos, or nature reserves. But again, how can we politicize life as such? What might this look like as an organizational practice? 6. The Gaia hypothesis proposes that the Earth is a single self-regulating complex system integrating biological, atmospheric, and inorganic subsystems. With the biotariot, I would imagine a socialized version of this hypothesis. I'm sure that's the right word. The Earth as planetary commons. All life as constituting a realm of commoning which depends upon access to the planetary commons. So it's kind of self-sustaining. This would be to project not a divine earth goddess, Gaia, but Earth itself as a repressed, enclosed commons, lowly leveled and exploited. Earth not as singularity, but as complex multitude of life, coming under the impetus provided by globalization and climate change, into a new and necessary biosolidarity. We need to take the snatched body of the earth back